Our first presenter today is Dr. Ras Michael Brown. He is an associate professor of history at Georgia State University, whose work focuses on African diaspora communities and cultures, especially the connections between South Carolina and coastal Georgia, Lowcountry, and West Central Africa, with particular attention to spiritual traditions, ecology, and Gullah, Geechee, and Kongo cultural links. He is the award-winning author of African Atlantic Cultures in the South Carolina Lowcountry and co-leads the Gullah Geechee Sacred Land Project, documenting and preserving Gullah Geechee cemeteries. So everyone, please help me in welcoming Mr. Dr.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks for the invitation to participate. When I first got the communication to join you all today, okay, that's great. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, but I had a couple of ideas and thought about it. And actually, in the time that I thought about it at the very beginning was, I don't know, I think I had a little bit of a smaller idea of something that I wanted to connect with. And then as we got closer and closer, I was just thinking, you know what? I need to tie together a bunch of the different things that I work on and that are part of the larger research, teaching, community engagement I'm involved in. So I'm going to share some of that with you as well. And so in many ways, like with the title that you see in the abstract that you maybe have read, it gives you a sense for kind of some of the core ideas that are there. But a lot of the information, some of the ideas, some of the research strategies, all that has applications beyond particular Gullah Geechee context, or maybe dealing with coastal communities. And then in addition, all these communities are connected in, all communities are. And so part of finding the connections between those communities over time, that's the work that we're doing. So I just wanted to kind of give you that context a little bit coming in. And so in some ways, if I had given a title to this, where I'm at now mentally, if I had done that maybe a few weeks ago when I would have said kinship and kingcraft. I would have used that as the main facts, the main ideas that kind of anchor this. It's the same thing in many ways, but this is a different kind of way of talking about it that I think is something where maybe the work of a lot of academic and university historians like myself, the work of genealogy, this is where a lot of the paths cross. And some of the methodologies. And when I'm talking about kinship, I mean it in maybe more expansive ways than sometimes we think about it. It will be familiar to a lot of people once we start talking about it. But it's not necessarily the full range of possibilities are not always on our minds, or maybe at the forefront when we're doing our work and doing our research and all that. And partly it's because there's so many different ways of doing kinship that some of that knowledge just is not really immediately familiar to us. And so can I come at that way? Now there's this other term, kincraft. I don't know how many people have heard that particular term. I get it from 𝘠𝘰𝘶. She's a scholar at Harvard Divinity School, and she did a book called Kincraft, and it was about the development of identity within Black evangelical churches in recent times. But when I saw that, that's exactly the term. That's the term of a lot of the stuff, the main work, the main preoccupation, the main concerns for everybody, broadly speaking, but especially for Africans, African descendants, especially during days of slavery. It's the work of kincraft, which is creating kinship through all kinds of affinity, ways of connecting with each other, tracing, marking relationships, and creating them. So I have these two words, these two concepts are central to what I'm going to share with you, but also just the way that I approach this and think about it as a historian and beyond. Okay, and so with this occasion, I just have it here, just kind of thinking, all right, my task in many ways is to kind of provide a historical starting point, or the foundation of an earlier time, and then through the historical presentations, we do a step through chronology and build up into on Saturday when we have the strong emphasis on genealogy and many of the other aspects associated. And so in that sense, I'm going to do my best to provide a really big and firm foundation for some of the things that maybe can be revisited. I'm going to try. The other thing is with our work. When I say our work, okay, so I'm at the stage where as a university academic historian, the stuff that matters within our institutions are single author works. In my discipline, it's single author, one name on a book. But I'm kind of done with individual projects. I want to do things with people. I want to do this with colleagues. That's why with communities and everything. And so much of the work is going in that direction, including with my academic colleagues in Georgia State and other universities, as well as communities. So here's our work, and just give you a quick look at some of these things, because some of this may be interesting, but certainly useful to some. One that was mentioned already in the introduction is the Geechee Sacred Land Project. And when we talk about preservation of cemeteries, really what we're talking about here, the preservation physically, culturally, and in memory of these sacred spots. And so there's physical preservation component, and then there's a deeper cultural, historical research. The way that I like to describe it is that the main goal of it is to construct and enable for future reference and work within the community and outside of these community and spiritual genealogies. And these places are the focal points for those community and spiritual genealogies. And so that's a big part of it, just to let you know, because this is one of the things that's a little bit unusual about the way that we do it, is that we have a mapping stage, and that's with GIS, and I mean state-of-the-art equipment, not the stuff on your phone. I'm talking about using survey techniques and also other software and stuff like that. I don't do it beyond my expertise, but I got experts who do it. They do the mapping, they document so many things about the physical spaces and create amazing digital maps, that kind of stuff. It's incredible stuff. And then they also do ground penetrating data. And so in that stage, one of the things is a person who does not do that, like works with people who does, it really resonated with me as a historian, because in a lot of ways, the work that I do is similar to that kind of mapping. And one of the things that happens, even in a lot of cemeteries or burial grounds, there's a lot of mark. We physically see a burial, but there's no marker. And there may not be a memory, a living memory of who's there. And then there are spaces, and there are people in those spaces. And sometimes you see depressions, and that lets you know by eyesight, but sometimes you don't. And it's the GPR that does the work. It says, somebody's here. So that's a lot of the history too. It's just you don't know who's there, and sometimes you don't know that there is somebody there that you can find. And so that's kind of the larger work. And there's some examples of it. I'll save it for later just to make sure I can say some of the things I want to share with you, and then we can talk about it more, I suppose. But that's kind of how I look at it. And so there's multifaceted work. And once we do that mapping, then we do much deeper kind of community documentation, also digitization of funeral programs, all these kind of setting up data sets, databases, so people can find people and all of this. There's just a ton of interesting facets to it that are really important. And then there's where I really step, is that a lot of times we have community memory, and we have fairly accessible documentation, but you all know, especially with genealogy, that at some point you hit that wall. My job is to find a way through the wall, because I start on the other side. And my work is to build forward so that we can find some way to go through and make those connections. And that's kind of maybe one of the things, and maybe some of the different directionality of some of the ways that we approach our work. But that's where they converge. And I'm kind of just as a more of a personal revelation is just that, if there's nothing, if there's emptiness and there's silence or there's whatever, that's where I'm gonna go. I just have a thing for it. It's like, oh, you can't do that, there's nothing there. Oh, yeah. And so we know that there's a lot of that, especially the further back we go. That's kind of my job, is to go back and make connection forward with all of the concerns and the desires that people want to make those connections. That's what's driving my work. So that's what we do through this. Right now, we're working with some coastal communities across Georgia. We'll be working on that definitely for the next couple of years and then beyond. We'll see how it goes. Right now, we're able to do it because the Mellon Foundation has funded us, which is really great and makes a difference. So that's part of it. But then there's another thing, and this is something that I was brought in to do with Elizabeth West, and who was also a faculty member at Georgia State. It's the data mining and mapping antebellum Georgia. You put that in, you can go to the website. You know the website named that. You go in there and find out. I'll just tell you what it is in short. It's work we did where we, and a team at Troy State in Alabama, we created 2 data sets based upon slave schedules, 1850 slave schedule, and then Will's state documents, and coordinating those and then plotting them spatially. And so when you go there, there's a great data set to find out. This is for Harris County because we're basically doing proof of concept for this approach. And there's so much more that's available there. And it's one of those things that sometimes provides a direct path for descendants and other researchers to find the people they're looking for, to find the places there. And Harris County is especially interesting because Georgia's especially like this, but where African descendants of enslaved people were moved fast, one place to the next place to the next place. This is a way to catch people, to see people in that motion, and to take all of these kind of points of information, create data sets that allow us to see patterns that we can't when we're just following one line. Okay, and so that's a super interesting project. Take a look, see if it's anything interesting to you, and certainly as an example of some of the work that can be done. So get into that a little bit. And there's another thing, and it's through some of the people we worked with to help assemble this. We're associated with another data set. This is a new data set that just came out in June. It's in coordination with Juneteenth. And this is a data set that is of almost 2 million African Americans from the 1900 census. It's a data set. So it's not a thing where you have to look up specific things. Everything's connected. The fields that they line up are connected. And so it makes it useful for super macro analysis because one of the other people who's involved in it, he's an economist. He wants to use it for economic analysis, but you can use it for historical research. And it's since 1900 census gives us a range of certain kinds of information that we don't have together in one spot. Missing some information in 80 and 90s, and it's kind of a little uneven, especially 1890. This is a great way to begin that process of looking through. So I helped author an article that maybe introduces it, gives you some sense for it. And some of the things that we did with it. There's one thing that's missing. And this kind of leads into the next thing, is that it doesn't include kinship relationships that are documented in that census, and we see it a little bit earlier, but that's really full documentation. And Elizabeth and I, when we were organizing, you got to add this. You got to add kinship relationship. They said, "Oh, we just didn't. We're not going to do it now." It's like, okay, well, maybe next time. So we'll see. But that would have been the best thing. That really does remain kind of the real frontier of doing the data set work, is to establish kinship relations. So like with one of the big things with back to the Geechee Sacred Land, with the funeral program. Of course, funeral programs have lots of family information. Sometimes that's the only place you're going to find that document. we're creating the data set. All those relationships are there. So that when someone is looking for one person, they're going to find all of the other people. And ultimately, in the long term, we do this enough and we come up with what we think is a real useful protocol. So we can have a bunch of databases, a bunch of big one, whatever. It'll work for whoever contributes. So it's the ground floor of something like that, because the kinship is the most important. That sometimes that's how you find people, is through the kinship, not a direct thing. It takes you to the right network of people who are connected, and then you find people through that. So there's a lot of things going on. I just found myself in the middle of a lot of it, and it's where I need to be. Now, the thing is like with my work in particular, is obviously it's tied in with this. But like I said, I'm someone who starts way on the other side. I start with huge past. I mean, a lot of my stuff is based on understanding historical linguistics, comparative culture, all that kind of stuff that goes back thousands of years, with particularly within West Africa and Central Africa. But it gets a lot more detail as we get closer. And you know, for me, I spend a lot of my time working with archival sources, primarily from the 17th century, 18th century. And some are English, some are French, some are Portuguese, some are Spanish, some are the combinations of those. And then in some of the African languages that are representative of those sources too, because they do show up. Ubuntu shows up, 𝘕𝘶𝑗𝑠, some of the 𝘕𝑗𝑠 languages, all that stuff appears around. So I work with a bunch of that to then really understand some of these foundational identities, kinships, all of this kind of stuff, like cultural foundations for stuff. So that's where I come in, and I'm just kind of glad to be part of connecting something. So with that, I got a couple of things just to think about. And this is always the thing with any of our projects that we do, whatever connection, whatever proportion of history, genealogy, everything, is where and where do we start? Well, so I guess we're officially starting 250 years ago, because 250 is the date. And so that's, of course, 1776. But one of the things that is important for me, especially the way that I come from, is I start a lot earlier. And for me, even though it's revolutionary era, this is not a beginning in the way that I'm presenting it. This is a transformation. It's a transition. It's a stage in something that began long before, but it's a really important transition. And so there are some beginnings in there, but I treat it fundamentally as a transition. So like a number that I'm really interested in and understanding a little bit more is 400. Because 400 puts us at 1526. 1526 is when the first enslaved Africans were on these shores here in what's now Georgia. There was an expedition that was led out of Santo Domingo, which is primary Spanish colony. They just like they came. Maybe they were up at 𝘕𝑗𝑐 near Georgetown, South Carolina. Maybe they were Central Coast, Georgia Coast, Babylon Sound. But they were there. They were there for a little bit. And one of the reasons they didn't stay was because the fairly large number of enslaved Africans that were with them said, "We're not with this. We're gone." And they just said, "This is over. We're out." Where'd they go? Here. They stayed here. And with indigenous people going forward. So in a lot of ways, that's a really meaningful beginning point that we just don't think about, or know about, really. There's a lot of things that need to be understood or discovered about it and researched, and that work is happening. So I think about it in that sense, but we could also put it in some other sense. We could think about 1670, we could think about 1730, we could think about 1750. These are key dates in South Carolina and Georgia, history as colonies, dealing with slavery, all that kind of stuff. Wherever we start, we got to start somewhere that really gives us a lot of information going forward, a lot of understanding going forward. So I tend to want to go back as far as I can. I always keep going back all the time. But at some point, we just got to stop. And so for now, we'll kind of take our starting point as, really where South Carolina and Georgia then are emerging as colonial entities, but especially with the African descendants who are in those colonies and a few others who are free, but as those communities are developing and emerging. So very much late 17th century, 18th century. So that's where a lot of what I have to share is really focused. So with this, there's kind of an important part about placing the revolutionary era in an African diaspora context. Right? There's a few things that fit in there. Some of it is kind of like in an age of revolution. There's a lot of stuff that's going on. And one of the things that people think of immediately is, say, the wars of Saint-Domingue that then become the Haitian Revolution. That definitely is part of that extended era. But there's a lot of other ways to kind of frame it in the African diaspora context. And one of the things that's always important to realize is that because of enslavement, because of displacement to make money, so trades, slave trades, Africans were always on the move. Almost everybody who was a captive in several places. Through sale, through forced migration once they were already in a place. And so people were everywhere. And in many ways, whenever we kind of come in at a historical period, we're seeing them where they are then, but they'll be somewhere else later. Not always, but a lot of times that's what ends up happening. So we kind of think about it as like, okay, so this is a period of change, but it's also within a continuous thing where there's people coming and going. There's lots of big political changes. There's all kinds of wars that are happening. You can't even keep track of all the wars. It's just too many wars happening. Wars within different African regions, wars in the European colonial realm, wars in Europe. It's endless. But this is one of those big transition eras. The thing that I just want to briefly point out and just kind of touch on a little bit is the kincraft related to Gullah/Gullah, kincraft related to Igbo, Kisi or Kishi, and Mandingo. These are names, these are labels of identities, some of which are familiar and continue into the present, and others are more historical and exist in various ways, but maybe don't have the same meaning. These are markers of kinship, and the kincraft that was used to make them that tells us about different ways of kincraft. There's not just one way, there's multiple ways. And we're just gonna look at a couple. I'll just explain them just a little bit for you. One of the reasons why, in particular with Gullah, and Igbo that really stand out is because those markers of kincraft and kinship, those endured. They endure into the present. We know Gullah endures to the present. We know Igbo does because Igbo landing is really an important place. It's a cultural, spiritual site, identity site. These stick around a lot of ways. So the others, not so much here, but in other places, yeah. So we'll look at that briefly. But there's one thing that I want to point out too, is that kind of part of this deep history, this is for Gullah Geechee communities or the ancestral communities for Gullah Geechee communities, but also just broadly speaking, throughout the diaspora. There's many nations, but there's one. And that's one of the things that we see happening in a lot of these places, is that from the African societies that people come from, and then the societies that they build here, is they are culturally plural. People have multiple identities. People have multiple religions. And all that's normal. That was on purpose. Because that's kind of a way of how you create kinship, and kincraft is not homogeneity, it's just sameness. But it's how you connect the differences. So you don't grow just one thing in your garden, you try to grow a bunch of things in your garden. It's just like that. And that's how people live culture and identity. Okay. So we'll go forward a little bit so we can get there. One of the things that is important is just kind of we get a little snapshot, just a little bit about where people were and some numbers and some relative proportions. And so this is something just quick glance. We just a little glance of some large-scale population figures, and this will be from the first census for the new nation. So we'll take the revolution as a start and the creation of the new nation. And this is one of the first things that the new nation does is start keeping census. And so in this case, what we ended up with, we see some numbers, really estimates, in many ways, because basically our folks who are in any of these societies who are marginal or oppressed are always undercounted. So that's kind of the way it is now too. So we will take these as some guide. But one of the things that's really revealing here, and it's just something to keep in mind, is with the coastal counties. So this includes South Carolina, but then also the Georgia counties. So at that point, 1790, there's 3 coastal counties. Then they get split up in the 1793, and we get the more counties we have now. But the thing is that in terms of just the relative numbers, we see much larger number in South Carolina of people, and then much larger proportion of those folks in coastal counties, which is because that's where the plantation slavery and all that had been established for a long time, and that was the model. Upstate, upcountry, or what's now upstate, that was predominantly white. That's where a lot of the white immigrants were going, is into the interior. Georgia's different, partly because Georgia is, I just have to say, in this time, maybe not exactly then, but for a lot of those times, it's a colony of South Carolina. And as far as slavery goes, the planters and the people they enslaved, they were from South Carolina, and they extended here. And so there's always those connections. This is a family count, basically, because these folks are related to that. So the thing is that the big difference that you see here is that the proportion in the coast is a lot lower. And that's because up near Augusta and a lot of those counties, that's where first expansion was happening. This is what sets the stage, for those next decades that lead into the antebellum era and all that. It's already happening in Georgia. Georgia was always the forefront of that next thing that was happening with slavery all the time, over and over and over. This is where we see that move to the interior. The thing is, these are still connected communities, because the folks who are up in Augusta County, up in Wilkes County, all that, or Richmond, and up in Wilkes and all that, they came from somewhere too. They just didn't show up there from nowhere. They came from here. They came from the coast. They came from these communities. So it's a continuous colonization. And I have to think about it that way. And so we're seeing both the past before 1790, and we're seeing glimpses of the future after 1790. Okay. And so with that, that gives us a little bit of idea, but that's one snapshot. We can't start at 1790. We have to start before. And one of the reasons is because of the revolution. It's because of what happened and how it impacted. So we have these repercussions of the revolution. And these are the consequences that come. I'm not talking about causes, I'm talking about how it affected people happening and afterward, especially African descendant people. So a couple of things just to frame it. One is this revolution here was essentially, in one sense, a British Civil War. There was a civil war between British subjects. That's the white war, because you had to be a British subject to be in that civil war for the most part, some exception. So think about it that way. But then it was also a freedom war. I'm talking about for the British subject. They were already free. They just wanted something different, but they were already free. This was for people who were enslaved. And so we look at it in a couple different ways. Part of that was direct participation in combat hostilities between the American British subjects and then the ones who were loyal and all that kind of stuff. So the basic sides that we see with this. But then there are people who said, I'm out. I'm not part of this at all. I'm going to create an alternative society. We call them Maroons. There were always Maroons. But this time there were even more Maroons, right? And they something that's really insightful. One of the groups who comes about and is active in South Carolina and Georgia into the 1780s, late 1780s, is led by Captain Crujo, Captain Lewis. I had heard that quote. Captain Crujo's not his birth name. He took Crujo as his name to name himself after the leader of the first Marine War in Jamaica in the 1730s. So this is 50 years before. And he said, I am 𝘕𝘶𝘭𝘢𝘯. I am the legacy of 𝘕𝘶𝑻. So right there, you always think, okay, there's a larger context for this. They're envisioning this as something not just local, not a British Empire thing, but part of this larger struggle, part of this large ongoing war. So we would situate this, there's an interesting interpretive framework within really what are an extended period of struggle for liberation through violence in this case, through war, through military means, which we can collectively call the Gullah Wars. Yeah. And terminology itself comes from Stonewall Rebellion, which was often referred to as the Gullah War, which is 1739. But when you think about it, you say, where are they? If we can go back to 1526, that's the first Gullah War in a sense, because that was the first rejection and uprising. But we see it all consistently throughout, and we maybe even can take this, we definitely can take this through planning with Denmark BC in 1820s, and then also finally with the Seminole Wars, because Seminoles are a major part of their composition of people from these areas. They are extensions of Gullah Geechee communities. Many other roots and lineages, but ultimately we see a long stretch. And so this was part of that, right? So that's kind of a little bit of the context, but really one of the big impacts that we haven't wrestled with a lot as far as thinking about what this means for community and culture is in South Carolina, we know that there's about 3,000 Black loyalists. That meaning they fought with the British, and then they were relocated. And see the destination, Nova Scotia, Jamaica, and ultimately Sierra Leone. So that's people who are from these communities and are now gone. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. And then you think, okay, that's a lot of folks. That's a lot of families. That's the people we know about. But then this is the one this blows my mind. The estimates are that there could be as many as 9,000 people in Georgia who were relocated because a lot of those loyalists that were expelled or left, and they took enslaved people with them. East Florida is a big destination, but so is Jamaica, and then some other places. But the estimates, when you look at it like, oh, it's this many and then this many, then you add and say 9,000. Remember, in 1790, we're starting with 29,000. So that's a huge proportion of people who are gone that were part of this community. So what does this mean? How did this affect things? So it's a very big disruption and transformation on a lot of levels. And we've got to try to figure it out. But it also creates a bit of a wall, but also some opportunities because a number of these folks are documented, like the Black loyalists from South Carolina are documented. So people may find folks far afield, not quite where you thought you might find them, but through those. So this is kind of one of the things that we get. So this is where we get to our kinship a little bit and understanding. So I want to have this idea that where we think of kind of two broad categories, countrymen. I'm just going to use that because that was the contemporary term, but we're talking about men and women. Countrymen and country-born. Those were the terminologies back in the 18th century for people who were born in Africa, people who are born here, okay? The main thing that we always have to keep in mind is wherever they're born, they're still kin. Okay, there's this idea that somehow there's this fundamental divide and antipathy between African-born, Creole-born, locally born. So that comes from enslavers because those folks were kin. So there's something else at work, but this is something that pops up a lot. But one of the things that I want us to understand as we kind of move through this the next few minutes or so is with African, I want us to kind of understand that the way people used it in those days, you see the continuation of that in the institution thing. Where's the African Baptist? African shows up again and again. It's not about where people are born. It's about lineage. It's a term of kinship, term of heritage and kinship. Kinship is the main idea. So that's one of the reasons why that stuck around and had resonance, is because people were thinking about it in terms of kinship first, not citizenship, not culture even, not religion, not anything like that, but in terms of kinship. One of the ways that that was expressed with labels that we call nation name, nation identification. This shows up all the time in the sources. They'll say somebody like Congo nation. And they'll say Congo country, or they'll say, Mandingo nation, all that kind of stuff. But that was one of the ways that people expressing it. So that's a form of identity that doesn't mean a state. It's not a form of citizenship or something like that. It's a form of kinship. It's who are your people? That's your nation. Your nation is your people, and that's what they're telling us. There's really kind of 5 of these, these 5 forms of this kind of identity, that lineage of kinship. And I think of regional, which is based on place, lineal, which is based on blood ties, but perceived immediate kind of like family ties, direct kinship ties, cultural, meaning people may not have lineal ties, but they share a lot culturally. Then there's the experiential. And the key thing in this case, when we talk about experientials, like a lot of people came over on the same ships. And in many places, they were now kin. Because they had made the crossing together, they are now kin. And so in a lot of places, people refer to each other as Malungu. Malungu, it's a Bantu term, and it's like a complete circle. It's the idea is like we're tied together. And so they refer to that because they cross together. So that would be an experiential kinship. And then there was individual. So like somebody would have a nation name to mark themselves as an individual relative to other people, but it's just part of who they are, and it may not have a connection to them. We've got these 5 key ways of kind of understanding kinship in this. Big thing to understand through all of this, even as origins, birthplaces, and cultures change, because history, that's the way the kinship remains the basis. Always kinship. Kinship first. Once we have that common framework, that understanding, then a lot of the other pieces come together. Well, this last part, I'll just kind of give you a sense of, maybe seem like a bit much at once. I will get there, and that way we can maybe do some Q&A. Discuss some stuff. The big thing, of course, is talking about forced displacement to the Americas, and this is a nice little detailed chart just to kind of look at the dynamics of it, the overall dynamics of it. This is to South Carolina and Georgia specific. Okay. And one of the things that we see here, this gives you the idea of how many people in these given years were documented as coming over. There's people who aren't documented, but this is a lot. This is the majority of them. And there's 2 really important points where we see kind of a break in the movement of people, the displacement of people. The first one is the first Gullah War, the Stono Rebellion. That more or less put an end to a big period, the first big period of bringing people over, and then the independence. That's where you see a bottoming out. Those are the only, any other time there's people coming. Here we have, it's a little bit choppy in the 80s, 1780s, 70s, 90s. That's partly the U.S. figuring out its trade relationships and diplomatic relationships in the Americas. There's peaks and valleys with that. And then what you see is that last big bump right there. That's right before the transatlantic slave trade is constitutionally expires here. It's in the Constitution. That's where this happens. That's what happens. People heard about that. But really what's important here is to see the importance of these events, these developments in terms of creating periods of movement of people, and thus the formation of communities and cultures and all that. The independence war is one of those key transitions where it's just like there's an end point and a beginning point for a different era. So that's what we look at. And then I can give you a documentable account of people who were brought to South Carolina and joined us. 250,000 people over this time period. One of the things that we see then is with, particularly with Gullah kindcraft, so the origins of that is probably have to be the main thing to focus on. Is you see folks being brought from that region, and that's what's highlighted within the graph at key times and in very large numbers. That first big surge right there, that's foundational for a lot of the development of plantation sectors in South Carolina and Georgia. So that's a really significant time for all these transformations. Thing is this, the name itself tells us a little bit about how it's part of kinship. It does come primarily from Angola, the name Angola, which was the name that was given to Portuguese colony in West Central Africa, and then the British just called all of West Central Africa Angola. They just said it's all Angola. The thing is that it's also an actual word in those cultures. And where the terminology came from Portuguese was that the title of power and leadership for the 𝘕𝘠𝘰𝘠𝘰. Whoever possessed the Angola, they were there. So it was the source of community connection and power. Everybody throughout the region, when they heard the word Angola, they knew force, power. They even named important fish after it, all kinds of things that were super important to them culturally, had Angola. So hearing it, it's like, okay, this means something. So they would hear it in slavery, because that's what enslavers call it. And they said, oh, I already know what that is, but I think I know it differently than you do. And they started to build an identity around it. So in this instance, the way we look at it, it is a regional and cultural affiliation. It's a kinship where people knew that they came from the same place, but they also saw those cultural resonances. So they got two of those kinship. That's how they built. But then there's this other part. It became a lineal one. So a third of those, and part of it was because during this period, right here, at least 2/3 of the people who were brought were men. And those men some of those men became the fathers of the country-born people who came next. Because it's in the next generation that the country-born people have more numbers than African-born people, because the children of the African people were brought in. And interestingly enough, the terminology in the cultures there is tata for father, and that was a word that was retained for father within these communities. And so they're the fathers of this new thing. So we have this identity, kinship, through that kinship, is regional, cultural, and lineal. There's more. So maybe we could talk about it sometime. There's something that's interesting relative to Congo, because Congo is a big one, and that's the term that people use elsewhere in the diaspora. So this is unusual. Here, unusual to have that. But there's another part, and actually probably what I'll do, since for timing and everything, I'll just stop with this observation. Maybe we can talk about is DNA. So DNA is really important. Here's the thing. When you look at these numbers and all that kind of stuff, you see the historic surgery, the DNA results don't seem to mirror those. They skew really hard towards West African sources. There's a reason why. It's because DNA from West Central Africa, from Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola, one, there was hardly any before. They just don't have the samples. So what they'll use is samples from people from Cameroon, some of whom are related to people from all the rest of Africa as kind of like proxies. So like you might get a result and say, Cameroon, probably not. It's probably that's a distant kin to people from Angola. And there is more DNA samples from people in Angola now, but they're proprietary. They were funded by research, and those researchers are the only people who can use them. They haven't made their way into the databases for the test kits now. So if you don't see a lot of Angola, Central Africa, not because those ancestors aren't there or in, it's just because they're not in the database. But they were there. Okay. And so if there's one thing that's with the diaspora, you've got a 50-50 chance of having Angolan ancestry all throughout the diaspora. Nowhere else is like that, because this almost half of all the people who were enslaved or brought over came from here. And so there is that kinship. And it's deeper, and it's at a deeper level and all that, but I guess we'll have to talk about it later. So, all right, so I'm gonna stop right now. We could do more, but if we want to do some Q&A.
A little bit more about that, not the word you used, displacement and the migration or whatever from South Carolina to Georgia.
Yeah.
Like, so the British located, you said, 3,000 from South Carolina.
Oh, in the revolution?
Yes.
Okay, so 3,000, at least 3,000 Black loyalists. So they were very openly and actively affiliated with British military forces. Those folks go through the process of exile, resettlement, because there's a weird situation, especially in South Carolina, where basically a lot of the white loyalists were reintegrated. The Black loyalists weren't. I don't know where that happened. But the thing is that those folks were documented as part of it within the British imperial context, keeping track of folks and then resettle in other
And these are Africans or formerly enslaved people who were
Yes.
promised their freedom.
Yes.
For fighting in the
Yes.
American Revolution.
Yes, and the problem is, of course, freedom in that time and that place, all throughout the British world, all throughout everywhere. For African descendant people was iffy, to say the least, and especially in the British realm. And they had very limited choices about what they could do with their lives. They made the best they could of it. Now, one of the things that is a really important development out of that particular group that we'd say were from South Carolina, but other related ones in Nova Scotia and beyond, is that's really where we start to see the formation of a lot of communities and ideas, and even the theology of emerging Black Protestant Christianity. Because that's where it really, starting in the 1770s, and then you see people like John Morant and others who, they're all throughout the British colonies, but they're interconnected. And so they're, in a lot of ways, even though they're loyalists, they understand, they kind of have what we call like a Black Atlantic understanding. They know that they are in this realm, but they're their own people. And it's not one place, it's all these places. It includes Britain, it includes Canada, which is still part of that. It includes the Caribbean, includes Africa. And so the ideas there starting to create really a Black Atlantic identity, a Black Atlantic Protestant Christianity. And it's just beginning. And that's we see here. We see reflections of that here. Baptist and Methodist bodies and stuff like that. But those are also part of this larger process. So they're real influential.
That location happened after the war was over.
Mhm.
Same with the 9,000 in Georgia who were.
Yeah, that was different. That's a different one because the so-called reintegration of white loyalists in Georgia didn't happen the same way. It was like, go, get out. And it's like, it was just, South Carolina and Georgia are similar in a lot of ways, but they're also pretty different. And so in that sense, a lot of those enslavers go to East Florida, which for a little while was British, and then back to Spain. And then others went to Jamaica. And of course, there's always huge ties, ongoing ties between South Carolina, Georgia, and Jamaica. Maybe more so than a lot of people. We oftentimes recognize the Barbados connection, but Jamaica, it was constant. And so there's a lot of folks there who ended up in Jamaica and are part of then that new, the development of Jamaican society. But then some of the folks who resettled in East Florida, after it became Spanish, they went to the Bahamas. And so there's the family web is big, goes everywhere. So, yeah. Sure, yes, sir.
I just watched. I understand on the graph here why it's flatlined like in the Gullah Wars in the 1776. But why did it drop in 1808?
1808, that's the constitutional prohibition against transatlantic slave trade. That's when the Constitution says that's the earliest it could end, and that's when they ended it. And to simplify the rationale is because there's a lot of political power in Virginia, as we know, a lot of early presidents are Virginians, and Virginia and Maryland have the largest numbers of enslaved people. And what they wanted, the intent was to have a domestic slave trade, which is exactly what happened. Because they wanted to continue and expand the sale of slave people from Virginia and Maryland to the West. And so I do have this.
That's a question.
Yes.
You can give me a short answer on the first one.
I don't know if I can give you.
So you talked about the fact that people moved a lot. Enslaved people moved, even after enslavement, people moved around.
Yes.
Did kinships maintain in that movement? And as a researcher, how do you track and collect that data when people were moving kinship? And I imagine names changed. I found that to be in my own, names change, spelling of names change, and all that all the things that change. As a researcher, how do you track kinship and identity through all that movement? That's the first question.
One of the things is also just the recognition of reality that a lot of times kinship was broken. And so it was broken for people that they experienced it, and thus it's broken for us. We can try to reconnect through kind of like community level analysis. We can maybe put people in communities, not necessarily directly. That's kind of where I go. It's like, where are communities and people? And we can then maybe find or imagine if they ever come up again. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. But one of the elements, and this could be something that is another source that people should use, is that people move themselves, basically fugitive or runaways. They weren't necessarily running to Canada or running to Mexico, which sometimes they were running to family. And so in a lot of the advertisements for runaways, the enslavers who place the ad says, oh, they have people in da-da-da. They'll name the places. And because a lot of people who ran away were going to be with kin. Like I have, when I was doing some research relative to the 𝘕𝘶𝑗𝑒𝑒 Island, is that there was a fellow who had been enslaved to Camden County, and he was on the run. He says, oh, the enslaver was there. He's got maybe going to Savannah doing this, or to see family, to his family at the 𝘕𝑗𝑒𝑒. And the thing was, like, that's the only way we would know. And so in some cases, those give us clues where we see through that. Now, here's the thing, and this is where the data sets come in. And we're really at the ground floor of this, is wherever we have caches of names, and so that can be probate inventories, that's bills of sale, that's all kinds of things, is that if we can construct these data sets where we not just have names, but we see where there's indications of relationships to people, because sometimes people were sold and moved in units and family units, or there's some kind of connection, parts of those connections cross over. And through the data sets, we can see them in a way we couldn't just on individual research, but it's the building of the name data sets, kinship relations when they show up, and then the way to link those data sets. That's a technical thing that's real tricky, is linking data sets. But once we can make that breakthrough, we may be able to kind of triangulate those connections where otherwise there was this big gulf and you just didn't know. Now we can hop over it because we got those connections, but we're building those things. That's what some of those projects are. It's like building needs to be built. So yeah.
Second question.
Yeah.
You're a historian.
Yeah.
I'm sure I had history classes somewhere when I was in high school.
Yeah.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Where would you, but I'm developing a desire to learn history in a way that I didn't 50 years ago. Where, as a historian, how would you, where would I begin? What does that trajectory look like in terms of my learning?
You know what, I think it really resonates from kind of like the work that folks, everybody here is part of in one way or another, is the research. Start with the research, because that research leads you to the history. So let that be your way in, because you'll see things in the history that otherwise you might miss. And, you know, just like with the particulars, of course, it's going to be, you know, who and where you're looking at. But that's, to me, that's the real method. You know, it's the method, is the research leads to that part. That's when it really is. 'Cause I did plenty of history through my career, but the stuff that really stuck and grew in me was when I started to research. I learned it in the classroom, and I learned it at home and all of that. But it really started to stick with that research. Yes, please.
You listed a number of the people that were there during that time period. Did countrymen and country-born population outnumber the white settlers there?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. Once we get into like 1708 or so in South Carolina, that's when you have a black majority. There's black majority. That remains the case through into the antebellum period. And in some places, like for example, with the coastal counties themselves, I don't think of Beaufort County and Charleston County, which Charleston County back then was huge. It's a bunch of counties now. There's like the population there at 1790 was 73–75%. And so that, and then of course, when we look at one of the coastal counties in Georgia, it's the same thing. But that kicks in a little bit later. Yeah, it's very much.
Everybody